Hello, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good, thank you. All right, so we are so excited to have everybody here today. It's great to have such a great response. GLEC is so excited to host Christopher Russell. He is the project coordinator at the New York Deaf Blind Collaboration. As a project coordinator at the New York Deaf Blind Collaboration, Chris has facilitated extensive training and coaching on topics related to CVI identification, assessment, and intervention. The schools, agencies, hospital staff, families, and itinerant related service providers. Chris has extensive experience in conducting and coaching CVI range assessments for a wide range of students in terms of age, additional disabilities, including deafblindness and current visual functioning as measured on the CVI range. He also has extensive experience in working with teams to use results of CVI range assessments for IEP development, development of CVI schedules, and other functional intervention plans. As a former classroom teacher in TVI, Chris has also had direct experience working with students who have CVI and implementing assessments, guide interventions to achieve measurable progress in visual functioning. So, with all that said, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Russell to talk to us today.
Hi there, this is Chris. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm really happy to be here with you all today. I am just going to share my screen and make sure I'm set up. I'm not as accustomed to Microsoft Teams as I am to other platforms, so let me just make sure I have it under control. I'm just going to share my desktop so that I can actually open up some videos and share them with you as well. The one thing is I'm not sure how to view the people waiting in the lobby. I'm not sure how to view the chat box on Microsoft Teams. So, and I don't know if I can do that at the same time as presenting. So
we can be a chat monitor for you.
Okay, that sounds great. Let me just there. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Connecting. Yes, beautiful.
Let me plug in my computer too. Okay. Okay, it's such a pleasure to be here with you today. And just in my conversations and planning this, and I
You know how to switch it from the computer to the screen?
Who the audience is, and if we were in person, I would love to do like a go around and kind of get to know everybody and do intros. But I also have probably twice as much content as I do time to present it in, right? So, so I'm just gonna kind of get right into it. The goal for today is really to get a comprehensive overview on CVI. So the first session really is an overview, 9 to 11, and that we're going to dig very deeply into understanding CVI in overarching terms. The major goal for the first session is for everybody to feel comfortable with the CVI characteristics and phases of CVI, so that by the end of this first session, you feel like you have a good understanding of what is unique about CVI, as well as how to recognize and observe and make sense of visual behaviors you see in your students. So I understand that everyone will have had different levels of training.
I felt like an idiot, but
make sure that if you could just make sure that your mics are muted, and then feel free to unmute in order to ask questions. Feel free to interrupt me throughout if you have any questions for clarification, anything that we've been talking about, or if you have you know, aha moments about your students or examples that really connect with what we're talking about. Feel free to take me on a tangent. I will be happy to go there with you. And I think some of the most interesting conversations come out of these sort of extension discussions. So the goal for the first session is really to get a shared understanding of CVI characteristics and phases. Regardless of how much training you've had on CVI in the past, there will be something new for you today if you're brand new to it or if you have had some decent amount of experience and training. And that's because I find that really every single student that I meet with CVI and every family and every team that I work with, I get new information, new examples, and a new understanding myself. So I like to say if you haven't had a comprehensive training on CVI in the last year or 2 years at the most, then there's something new in the field as well. So I'll introduce you to a lot of resources. I try to be super practical and give you things that you can take and actually use in your work. And then the afternoon session is really diving deeper into understanding appropriate educational interventions for students with CVI, both in terms of program development and what to include on an IEP, but then more practically in terms of what meaningful and appropriate intervention looks like, depending on where your student falls on this range of visual functioning. So let's just get right into it. And again, please do feel free to interrupt me. As I said, I probably have more content than we have time, so I'll just keep going. But do feel free to kind of rein me in, or if you have a question or something you want to dig deeper into in conversation. So let's get a shared definition first. You probably have some idea about what's different about CVI or what CVI is. It's useful to have some language that you can use when you're communicating with team members and families, and also just so that we can all have some quality control in what we're doing with kids with CVI. So I'm going to give you a lot of language that you can use throughout the session today. Basically, CVI is a neurological visual impairment as opposed to an ocular visual impairment. It is a specific neurological visual impairment, and there are other types of neurological visual processing disorders that are different from CVI. Those sort of fall into the larger umbrella category of cerebral visual impairments or neurological visual impairments. CVI is specific. CVI has to do with vision loss due to some sort of abnormality in the brain, which could be from injury or could be from a specific condition or syndrome. And the problem is not in the eyes. The problem is not in the information coming through the eyes. The problem is in the understanding of that information in the back of the brain, in the visual cortex. We now understand, and this is probably over the last 10 years, we now understand CVI to be the leading cause of visual impairment. We used to say in children in the US or in developed countries or something like that, but I think it's more accurate to say in countries or even in regions of this country that have access to quality neonatal health care. The emphasis on neonatal health care is because the main causes of CVI have to do with traumatic experiences related to early preterm or low weight birth. So essentially, these are kids who were not surviving birth complications, mostly related to prematurity or birth accidents 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And now these kids are surviving at a much higher rate. And so there's a much higher risk that they survive with some degree of neurological trauma. And CVI is one of those things. CVI is totally different from other non-brain related visual impairments. Ocular visual impairments or ocular motor visual impairments. Ocular visual impairments or ocular motor visual impairments, if you know what the condition is, and you know how severe it is, and you know whether it is progressive or stable, you can sort of guess what the impact on visual impairment is going to be, what the impact on the student's visual functioning is going to be. So for example, if you have a child, if you have a student in your class who has congenital glaucoma, right? You know what congenital glaucoma is. You know what parts of the eye it affects. You can see the cross section of the eye on the top left there. And you know the symptoms of glaucoma, right? You know that congenital glaucoma is going to bring with it, reduced visual acuity, some blurring of vision depending on how severe it is. It might cause some restricted visual fields. So there may be, some peripheral fields missing, maybe like a slight tunnel vision. It also is going to cause reduced contrast sensitivity and in some cases photophobia or light sensitivity. And we know that that's totally different from the impact of, say, retinitis pigmentosa, which is going to cause difficulty with night vision, a tunnel vision, a visual field loss that looks different. Usually in retinitis pigmentosa, central vision is intact. So there isn't actually acuity loss. There's just a peripheral loss that's pretty severe. And then there's a color and night vision issue. Okay, totally different impacts of these two different visual impairments. If we know how advanced they are, how severe they are, and whether they're progressive or stable, we can sort of figure it out from there. So if you're a TVI, which I know many of you are TVIs, if you're a TVI, then you know how important the clinical vision exam is for a student who has an ocular visual impairment. You really need to get a very good report from an ophthalmologist or an optometrist. And that's going to help tell you what to be looking for when you go to do your functional vision assessment. For CVI, we can't do that. For CVI, we can't look inside the eyes and see what's going on because typically there's not really any issue in the eyes. That's not the problem. The issue is further back in the brain. And furthermore, we really can't even tell what's going on functionally by getting a good MRI. Even a micro MRI or an fMRI is not really going to tell us enough about what's going on with the student's visual functioning. An MRI for a child with CVI is really just going to tell us whether it looks like the child has CVI or not. Or is there a risk factor observed in the brain that feels like, yeah, they probably have CVI, but it's not going to tell us how severe. Okay, kids with CVI can also have additional ocular visual impairments. And of course, if they do, we need to look at the two things almost separately and think about the overall impact that it has on the child. So most commonly, what I see out in the field, working with many kids with CVI, most commonly I see some kind of strabismus or amblyopia, right? An ocular motor issue, the eye is drifting out like an exotropia or in an esotropia. And if that's the case, you need to kind of just look at that and treat it separately. But that's very different from the impact of CVI. My suspicion is, and I don't really know exactly if this is true, but my suspicion is that kids with CVI may be at risk for developing an ocular motor issue, like an eye turn, because they have strong field preferences. So, and we'll talk about this with characteristics. If a child with CVI is really preferring to look at things only on the left side, then the right side, the right eye, over time is going to get weaker. And that could develop into amblyopia, lazy eye, or strabismus. The strength of the muscles, of the ocular motor muscles, is going to be compromised. Okay. So the other one that I see, and this is just a very brief tangent, the other one that I see quite frequently is optic nerve atrophy or optic nerve hypoplasia. And I heard from a neuro-ophthalmologist and who has a lot of knowledge about CVI out in California. He said that his name is Dr. Borchert, Borchert, and he has a couple of articles about CVI from the ophthalmologist standpoint. And he suggested that it's likely that most kids with CVI have some degree of optic nerve hypoplasia or optic nerve atrophy. And I guess that's because if the information in the brain is not getting processed properly over time, it's going to cause a weakness in the information that's coming through the optic nerve or the strength of the optic nerve. So I'm guessing that would be like a developed optic nerve hypoplasia. Okay, so important to understand. Okay. In order to diagnose CVI, this is really a functional diagnosis more than a clinical diagnosis. We can't look inside the eyes, and really we can't look inside the brain and tell exactly what's going on. So it's more like an alignment of functional characteristics. There has to be some history of brain injury or malformation, and we'll look at the list
and click on the JAWS icon.
for what those might be. There has to
Do
be
me a favor and click on the JAWS icon. It's refusing to start.
Can you guys make sure that your mic
Do I need
is
double click or just double, I think?
Thank you. And again, feel free to unmute if you want to interrupt and ask a question or anything. So there has to be some history of brain injury or malformation. There has to be a medical clinical eye exam, and the reason is we need to know that what we're observing that's abnormal visually cannot be explained by an ocular visual impairment, okay, including severe optic nerve hypoplasia or optic nerve atrophy. And then critically, we have to have the presence of unique visual characteristics. These are the unique visual behaviors that are specific to kids with CVI. Without these unique visual characteristics, it's probably not CVI. And I've seen several kids who, do have some atypical visual behaviors and do have a history of neurological, impairment or trauma. But the behaviors that we're observing really are not the same as these CVI characteristics. And so my suspicion then is that there's some other neurological visual processing disorder happening, but not cortical visual impairment. And there is an excellent book through the through AFB Press, American Foundation of the Blind Press, called Vision and the Brain, by Dr. Luke and Dr. Dutton, which is about the broader spectrum and range of neurological visual processing disorders. But that's different from cortical visual impairment, which is marked by these specific visual behaviors. So if you see other things going on that don't kind of add up, the other thing is if you're using the CVI range with a student and it has results kind of all over the place and it doesn't really match, that's probably because it's not cortical visual impairment. It's probably some other form of neurological visual problem. Okay, so here's a short list of medical history that is significant for CVI. Those first two are the most common causes of CVI. And if we have like a sign language interpreter, I love asking them to finger spell these because these are some tongue twisters, right? Hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy and paraventricular leukomalacia, HIE and PVL. These are two common traumatic experiences related to lack of oxygen or too much oxygen going to the brain, which premature infants are at high risk for. So premature low weight births, high risk for HIE and PVL. HIE is essentially asphyxia, hypoxia. PVL is an anoxic brain injury that results in deterioration of the white matter around the brain or death of white matter around the brain. Both can cause CVI. So when we see it, you see at the very bottom, it says prematurity is not a cause. When we see, the child's birth history was very premature, we want to look out for those terms. Did they have a hypoxic or anoxic brain injury? Did they have PVL? And if they did, that could be the cause of CVI. Prematurity is not a cause, it's a risk factor. In a similar way, cerebral palsy is not a cause, it's an associated condition because whatever caused the cerebral palsy, prenatally or perinatally, could have actually caused CVI at the same time, like a stroke or some sort of structural anomaly. Okay. Seizure disorders, traumatic brain injury at any time of life could cause CVI. It doesn't have to be at birth. I think we need more research on understanding which chromosomal disorders are associated with CVI, but there are many chromosomal or genetic disorders that are associated with CVI as well. Okay, other things like agenesis of the corpus callosum, the strand that connects the right and the left hemispheres of the brain is thin or missing, and that could cause CVI too. Okay. The most common, frequently asked question that I get from families and from professionals is this: the clinical eye reports came back normal or unable to test, but I know that the child or the student's visual functioning is not typical. So what do I do? The first thing I would say is that there's no such thing as unable to test. Unable to test means find another doctor. Okay, unable to test means that that particular clinician didn't use alternative methods of testing and is basically just saying that the traditional methods of testing don't work with this student, so I don't know what to do. But there are always alternative methods of testing, even if they're more functional tests and less clinical. Okay. The other thing is that when the clinical eye report comes back normal, that's not a surprise because there's really nothing wrong with the child's eyes, right? It's the brain where the issue is happening. So you want to ask, and I would encourage families especially to ask this question before they make the appointment with the ophthalmologist or optometrist. Don't waste their time to go into an appointment with a doctor that doesn't diagnose CVI and really doesn't know about it. Don't assume that all ophthalmologists recognize, diagnose, and understand CVI. And that doesn't mean that they're bad ophthalmologists. Ophthalmologists are trained to understand the structure of the eyes, not the visual processing in the brain. So they may not be equipped and they may not have assessment tools and methods that are appropriate for looking at that. Because remember, it's a functional diagnosis, not a clinical one. Go to a low vision specialist. They could be an ophthalmologist, an optometrist, a neuro-ophthalmologist, an ophthalmologist who has specific expertise in neurology, who does. And as a community, out in your area in Louisville, or if you're outside the Louisville area, your best resources are each other. Ask each other and get a decent list to recommend families to. I know as professionals, we always have to be a little careful recommending specific specialists, but could you get like a list of doctors to say, hey, here's a handful of doctors, try one of these guys, and help ask the questions too. Give families a short list of what questions they should be asking. And the first question is, does this person recognize or diagnose CVI? If not, don't waste your time. The other thing is that clinical assessment really doesn't give you that much information. And that's because it can't. We're looking at the brain, we're looking at the eyes, we're really just getting a diagnosis. And that's unlike ocular visual impairment, right? For ocular visual impairment, the clinical assessment is critical and we really need that information. But for CVI, that testing doesn't really give us much information. It just gives us the diagnosis. And it also rules out or confirms the presence of additional ocular issues. What's critical is that we follow up any clinical assessment with functional vision assessment. All right, why is it so important for us to identify and assess CVI? Unlike ocular visual impairments, with CVI, we should actually expect to see improvement in visual functioning if we're doing the right thing, if we're making the right interventions. Now think about that for a sec. If you work with students with ocular visual impairments, you're not expecting their vision to improve. Instead, you're teaching them compensatory skills to get around the fact that they have a visual impairment and to still access information and succeed and develop independence in their their access to the world and to education. With CVI, We are still teaching compensatory skills. We're still teaching the students skills to kind of, navigate what it's like to be in the world with that specific visual impairment and to still access information and succeed anyway. But we're actually targeting our intervention toward improving visual functioning. And that's why we need to have relatively frequent functional vision assessment, definitely annually. We need to have an update on, well, what's happening? Is there progress? And what's that progress look like, even if it's, subtle? Our interventions have to be based on assessment, and the reason is that we use different approaches depending on where the student falls on a range of visual functioning, and that's the CVI range. It's a way of determining what is the unique impact of CVI on this student, and also where does that student fall on a range of severity. Phase 1 is the most severe, phase 2 is moderate, phase 3 is closer to typical visual processing. And we're going to dig pretty deep into those and recognizing what they look like this morning. Now, I'm probably preaching to the choir, and I know that I have different roles here, that different professional roles are here. Not just TVIs. We have other folks on the team of various roles, related service providers, teacher assistant, paraprofessionals, and so on, and even administrators. Now, intervention should always be a team effort, right? And that's sort of a given. But the way I like to explain it with CVI is that you cannot make neurological progress in a 2 times 30 weekly session with a TVI. It's not going to happen. To make neurological progress, which is actually the goal of CVI intervention, we need to integrate these approaches all throughout the day. So everyone needs to have a solid foundation in understanding CVI. It doesn't mean that everyone has to become a TVI. We're not asking other team members to, to take on the role of a TVI. And frequently you hear people say, well, this is not really my area of expertise, and I thought the TVI is supposed to be doing that. The TVI has a role. Everyone else's role is to figure out, with the support of the TVI and anyone else on the team who has a good understanding of cortical visual impairment, everyone else's role is to figure out, how does this specific condition, how does this child's visual impairment impact their access to information in my activity, in my goals? So the PT needs to understand, what is the impact of CVI on the PT activities, the speech, the OT, the classroom teacher. Everyone needs to kind of be thinking about, how is CVI impacting access to instruction and to goals, and what are the adaptations and the interventions that I need to implement. And it's okay if you don't feel totally comfortable with that yet. It's about getting there and working together to figure out what it looks like. Okay, so everything I just said and more is on this 2-page fact sheet that I made for professionals and families. And the idea here is that we shouldn't have to recreate the wheel and explain this, every single time and just come up with it out of thin air. It's good to have some shared language and shared ways of understanding and thinking about these things. And so everyone on the team could have a copy of this, including the family. And this gives you sort of the overview. What is CVI? How is it different? How is it diagnosed? What are the characteristics and the phases, which we're going to talk about? And then the second page is answers to frequently asked questions and links to additional resources for families and team members. I can share this with you if I didn't already. You're more than welcome to reach out to me independently as well, if there's anything you want to follow up on, or if I share any resources that you want to get a copy of and you can't find it elsewhere. Okay. All right. So any questions? Everybody okay? Okay, feel free to ask if they come up.
Someone, how do we access?
Someone
What's
asked how they access the document that you just showed.
Yeah, I can share it with you all. And if I don't know if I sent it already. I can send it as a link to Ellen if that works. or Peggy.
Hey, Chris, it's Peggy. Yeah, if you want to send that to me, I'll send it out to people and then to the GLEC folks as well. That would be great. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you, Peggy. Okay, so I'll send it over to Peggy, and I'll send any other resources that come up today too. But do feel free to reach out to me as well if there's something that you can't find or don't want some clarification on. Okay, so it's useful to have a basic understanding of what's happening in the brain, and we're not going to go too deep into the neurology here, and I actually can't go too deep into the neurology because this is about as far as I understand it. But it's very useful to have this foundational understanding because we can't do a simulation of CVI in the same way that we do simulations of ocular visual impairments. If you have a child with glaucoma in your classroom, you can get or make a set of goggles to put on and walk around the classroom and see what would it be like to have advanced congenital glaucoma in this classroom. Or you can watch a YouTube video. Somebody's edited the scene to make it look like a simulation of having specific visual impairments. We can't do that with CVI, but if we have a good understanding of what's going on in the brain, then it can help us sort of look around at the environment and at the materials that we're using and think about, is this accessible or not? And if not, what do I need to do to make it more accessible? Okay. So in your visual cortex, in your back of your brain, your visual processing center, you have two primary streams of visual processing. And you can think of these streams like roads or highways through which the visual information is processed. Vision comes in through your eyes, it goes through optic radiations into the back of your brain.
Got my earphones working finally.
Processed
My
on a
earphones.
They weren't working?
No.
It's processed on a deeper level in the back of your brain in your dorsal stream and your ventral stream. And in typical visual functioning, typical visual processing, we are
You muted yourself, Chris.
Chris, you
Or somebody muted you.
if you hit Control Shift M, that will.
Oh, got it. Control Shift M is unmute. Okay.
Yep.
Good to know. All right. I think somebody muted themselves and then me at the same time. So, all right. So you got these two streams of visual processing, and in typical visual processing, they work together at the same time, and we take it for granted that these streams actually have separate functions, and we would never think of this because we use them together all the time. Whenever our eyes are open, we're using these two streams together. But in fact, they do have separate functions, and for kids with CVI, they're not functioning together properly. And one stream is functioning much, much better than another and develops earlier than the other. So you can probably see where this is going already a little bit. The dorsal stream gives you information roughly about where things are, but not what they are. So the dorsal stream gives you lots of information sort of from your peripheral vision. It's similar to the information you get from your peripheral vision. It gives you information about movement. Can you guys see my video of me too, or you only see my screen?
We can see you.
Yes,
too.
we can see you.
Cool. Okay. So I'm holding up right now this sort of like a bright magenta pen, bright magenta cap on this Sharpie. I'm looking straight ahead, right? I'm not looking at it. In my peripheral vision and my dorsal stream, I can tell this bright color. I can see what color it is. I can tell if it's moving. If it's illuminated, like with a flashlight, I can tell that it's illuminated. I get lots of information about this object in my peripheral vision, even when I'm not looking at it. But I get no information about detail. And it looks kind of blurry. I can see it's there. I can sort of see its rough form and shape, the color, the lighting, the movement, but I can't tell what it is if I didn't already know, and unless it's a very familiar, unique shape. And I definitely can't get any detail. I can't read the font on it. I can't tell, where exactly the clip on the cap is or the base. I don't get any of that information. In my ventral stream, I get that information about what it is I'm looking at. And we're activating our ventral stream when we make eye to object contact, which is direct visual fixation, right? Prolonged direct visual fixation, looking right at something with your central vision. And now, not only can I read the font and I can tell that detail, but I can also inspect all of the different unique features and details of this object, and I can sort of make sense of it much more. So in CVI, progress in visual functioning looks like this. At the lowest level of visual functioning, in early phase 1, we're only getting a little tiny bit of dorsal stream information. So maybe we're getting information about things that are bright, illuminated, bright colors, and have movement, and are presented in our peripheral visual field, right? As the child makes progress in their vision and they start to learn to look at more things, now they're starting to strengthen their dorsal stream and they can get more information about things that have different forms as long as they have light, movement, and bright colors. And then around halfway through the range, so actually at around 4 or 5 on the CVI range out of 10, we start to see the beginning of eye to object contact. And it's only brief, it'll be emerging. The student, does this kind of classic CVI thing of almost looking right through or past something. That's dorsal stream. As soon as they start to make brief eye to object contact, looking right at something, even if it's only in passing, even if it's only for a split second, as soon as we start to see real eye to object contact and fixation, that is a clear indication that the child is starting to use their ventral stream. As they continue to strengthen their vision and make progress in their visual functioning, it's all about strengthening the ventral stream way on into phase 2 and phase 3. It's all about strengthening the ventral stream. Okay, so and we're gonna bring this up several more times throughout the day and look at what is dorsal stream processing, what is ventral stream processing. But the biggest sort of cheat sheet item that you have for understanding or gauging how far along your student is in their visual processing is the student making eye to object contact or not? And if they are, is it just emerging or is it pretty consistent? That's going to tell us a lot. So here we can see in typical visual processing, we've got these 2 streams of vision. They're constantly working together, but they do actually have separate functions. Dorsal is more about spatial processing, kind of like where are things, and ventral is more about object processing. What is it that I'm looking at? So I said we can't really do a simulation of CVI, but here's a little rough one I came up with because I think it's helpful for people to be able to, for you to be able to explain this to other people that you work with. So, and to think about the classroom too. So right now I've got this mug full of pens and I'm holding it up again to my right side, a couple 2-3 inches from my face on my right side, and I'm not looking at it. I'm looking straight ahead. So it's in my peripheral field. I'm only getting dorsal stream information. You can also note that these pens are none of them are bright colors. They're black, gray, white. It's very hard for me I can tell that there's something there, right? But it's very hard for me to tell what exactly is going on here. It all kind of blurs together, this mug with a bunch of different gray tone, black, white pens. If I wanted to get any specific pen, if I wanted to reach and grab any specific pen, it would be really hard to tell. So let's say I want to get this one here, and I'm holding up this little white pen. I'm not looking at it, I'm looking straight ahead. Can I get it? And I kind of misreach and I get the wrong one. So what might I want to do in order to help me get that pen, right? One thing I can do is I can take away the other pens, and what I'm doing there is I'm reducing the complexity in this array of pens. So now there's only one target there. There's not all the other stuff making it blurry. Can I get it now? No problem, I got it, even without looking at it. But sometimes we can't take away the extra complexity. Like in a classroom, we don't want to, you know, we don't want to take away everything in a classroom and make it a non-functional environment. Sometimes I notice that when people learn a little bit about CVI, they want to run with it and they want to like paint the classroom black and have red tape everywhere. But that's overkill. It's not a functional way to adapt an environment. You don't need to take down all the stuff on the walls of your classroom. You just need to be aware of how that's impacting the student. So let's say that we can't take away this busy array. What else might we do? Well, how about instead of looking for this white pen that blends into the background, we're going to look for this bright red pen, this bright magenta pen that doesn't blend into the background. Can I get that? No problem. I reached for it and got it, even without looking at it. And that's because it really popped out. Even in this complex array, it was very easy to tell where that is with my dorsal stream vision. Another possible option is that we could shine a light on or illuminate the white pen that we wanted to get, right? We could illuminate that white pen. And if I had, 3 arms, then maybe I could reach it. I think I could get it actually, because I can, even with my dorsal stream vision, it really stands out. It's popping out right now. So those are just 3 ways that we could think about starting to adapt complex environments and complex materials. What we're really doing is we're making it easier for kids to find something using their dorsal stream vision, if that's what they have better access to. Okay. You could do the same type of simulation with your phone, right? On your phone, if you have a smartphone, you've got this very complex, busy array on your phone of all these apps and everything. And maybe depending on what your background is, if it's solid black, maybe that's easier. If it's a picture in the background, it's probably a lot harder. So same thing. If you're not looking directly at your phone, if you're looking 3 inches to the left of it, what can you actually access? Can you find the Messages app? I can find that because on an iPhone, the Messages app is bright green and it really pops out. But a lot of these other kind of gray tone ones, they really blend into the background and they're hard to access. So how much can you actually do from motor memory, and how much can you do based on what you're getting visually from it if you're not looking right at it? And that's a good simulation for kids who are using, say, AAC, or who you're expecting to look at complex arrays, on a screen. Okay, so what we're going to do now is shift into, and really like for the next probably 45 minutes, hour or so, we're going to shift into talking about these unique visual characteristics of CVI. And this is what really makes CVI stand out. And these are completely observable characteristics. There are 10 unique visual behavioral characteristics of CVI. And again, if you've had some training on CVI in the past, you're going to get something new out of this, because we're constantly learning more about what these characteristics look like. And I have some examples too that I think are illuminating. So when we go through each characteristic one at a time, what we're really thinking about is, how does this characteristic impact the child's visual functioning, their ability to use their vision to gain information throughout the day? And we're noting that the characteristics affect kids differently as they improve along the range, right? So it's still color preference, that's still the characteristic, but it looks different in phase 1, in phase 2, in phase 3. And this is another misconception about kids with CVI. Oh, they don't light gaze, they don't stare at lights, so that means that the characteristic of light must be resolved. Well, it's not resolved, it's just that it looks different than it looked earlier on the range. So they make improvements and they don't do the same behaviors as they used to do, but they still have something going on with that characteristic. And the CVI range is a scale from 0 to 10. 0 is no functional vision. 10 is typical or near typical functional vision. But the disclaimer is that there's no such thing as 0, because there's never a student with CVI who has no functional vision. And there's also no such thing as 10, because 10 would mean that the characteristics are completely resolved, and they never completely resolve. So we're somewhere between 0 and 10. All right. So as we talk about each characteristic, what we're looking at is what does it look like on the lower side of visual functioning, phase 1, maybe early phase 2, and what does it look like later as the student makes progress in later phase 2 and then on into phase 3. So the first characteristic is color preferences. Kids with CVI on the lower side of visual functioning may prefer to look at things that are bright, saturated colors only. They'll only look at objects that have a specific color. So maybe they're only looking at items that are red or items that are yellow. And they're not looking at things that have any other color on it. As they make progress in the range, they can look at multiple colors, and they can even look at objects that have multiple colors on them. But they benefit from color to highlight important information or to provide an anchor for their visual attention. So color is what we're using in order to show what to look at or to highlight a part or a component or a feature of a specific target. Something interesting is that, if we think back to our simulation, using your dorsal stream alone, if I'm not making eye to object contact, I'm just using my peripheral vision and my dorsal stream, I can get information about color. I can see what color this bright magenta pen cap is. Even duller colors, I can tell that this is kind of white or clear or gray. I can tell there's black over here. We get all of this information about color even without looking directly at something. Another interesting little factoid is that you don't actually even need to have a visual cortex in order to see red. You don't even have to have that part of the back of your brain in order to see the color red. Red can be perceived using your eyes and your optic nerve alone. My guess is that that's because of the wavelength that red is on. It's very, very easy to see. And also, in terms of just evolution, we probably learned, our eyes and our brains learned over time that things that are bright red in nature are things that we should probably avoid and certainly not eat. So it's not surprising that our brains know how to recognize red as like an alarm color. And if you think about it, in our world, we use this in universal design, right? We use the color red to indicate like emergency or lookout, or we use red for stop signs even, because it's really the easiest color to perceive, even when you're not looking. Even when you're only using your peripheral vision, you can see that bright red stop sign. So earlier on the range, we're maybe only looking at objects that have single, solid, bright, saturated colors. Maybe we're only looking at toys or items that are a single color, not multicolored objects. And it's usually going to be a bright, saturated color that would be easy to see in your peripheral field. Okay, things like Elmo, like, items that have one single bright, solid color. Slinkies, things that have movement and color, or pom-poms, things that have light and reflective properties and color. Further along the range, we can look at many different things, multicolored objects. We can look at more busy arrays and more busy targets, but we use color to anchor the student's attention to an important piece of information. So on the left side here of this little communication board, there's a red rectangle, and that's where she's going to put her tangible symbol, her communication symbol, in order to make it stand out. So this is what we're going to do now, and we're going to put that symbol over in the now category. Okay. This is a really cool one that I liked, where a student with CVI in like mid-late phase 2 was getting really disoriented around the classroom, and especially when it was busy and noisy, and he would get anxious and stressed, and he couldn't find the door independently to get up and go to the bathroom or whatever. And So rather than, again, like making an over adaptation, like painting the door red, that would be overkill. We don't need to do that. The team just took a little bit of red electrical tape and put it around the light switch to the left of the door. And that almost served like an exit sign, right? When the student was disoriented, he could scan the environment and find that bright red target. So think about if you're in a movie theater or, in a building, and what do the exit signs look like? The emergency exit signs. It's a bright red, usually the word exit. And if it's activated, it's going to be lit up as well, right? It's going to be bright red and backlit. It's going to have lighting behind it, so that when you're, in an emergency, let's say you're in a building where all the lights go out, the power goes out, or a building that is where there's a fire and there's smoke, you're going to be looking for that bright red illuminated target, and it's going to be pretty easy to find even in a dark or chaotic environment, and you're going to go towards that target. Well, it's the exact same thing that we're trying to do with students with CVI. We're trying to anchor their visual attention to an important landmark or target in order to show them an important piece of information, where something is, or in an educational context, we could even do that in a book. So here we go. On the left side, on the lower left, there's a picture of an adapted book. It's that, brown bear, and there's a picture of a dog. This is probably for a student in, early phase 2 who still needs some tactile access. So they put a little bit of like a furry texture on the dog's body so the student can still feel it and get some tactile input. And then they've got this shiny, reflective red collar that they put on the picture of the dog. And that really pops out. So it's going to help the student, okay, find the fur, that's the dog, it's furry. Now move to the right and let's find that, the collar, the red collar. And it's almost like it's a visual anchor, just like the light switch, or just like the tangible symbol. It's an anchor to support the student to know what it is that they're looking for and to orient everything else around it. So now you found the collar, okay, you can find the dog's face to the right of it, the body and the tail to the left of it, the legs underneath it. So it's almost like a good, strong visual point of reference. Now in the bottom middle, there's a picture of it's a cartoon of a little girl, and it's got red, what do you call that? Puff paint, on a little bit of red puff paint outlining the head, the shoulders, the knees, and the toes. And you guessed it, this is a cue card for a Morning Circle song, Head, Shoulders, Knees, and Toes. And for the student with CVI, in order to follow this and be able to tell really what she's looking at, they just added that little bit of color outline to anchor the student's visual attention to those important focal points or targets on the cue card. On the bottom right, same thing in a Morning Circle activity. They're asking the students, what's the weather today? And they're showing the student with CVI on an iPad 2 different choices. A cartoon sun for sunny, bright yellow. And then on the right side, the cloudy, right? A little cartoon, the blue sky with the white clouds on it. So using bright saturated colors that are visually distinct to really pop out and offer these 2 different choices. And you can see it's very simple. It's not a complex target that they're showing her. So this student on the bottom right side can see multiple colors. You don't have to make everything red, but we're using 2 distinct colors, bright yellow and then the bright blue with the white clouds on it. So it really pops out. Okay. And again, feel free to ask questions if they come up. We're just going to kind of like dive in and talk through each of these characteristics. The next characteristic is movement. Students with CVI tend to need movement to attract their visual attention or to sustain their visual attention at the lower side of visual functioning. So just like in our simulation, a student with CVI with this bright magenta target in their right visual field, they may not see it unless it's moving. It's there, but it's standing still and not necessarily orienting toward it. But as soon as it starts to move, you might see some orientation, right? Or to sustain, that means that once it stops, it's almost like it's not there anymore. So kids with CVI might only look at something that move or that has a quality of movement, like a shiny or reflective quality, like a pom-pom, or something else that has a, you know, a lit reflective property. This tends to help children with CVI with mobility, because when they're in motion, when they're moving, they can see a lot more things around them. So they may navigate around obstacles, you know, they may find the door of the classroom and walk right in. And this may be deceptive, right? This is where often you hear people say, oh, but you know, he did fine walking down the hallway and finding the classroom, so why is it that he can't look at the book when we're sitting for read aloud? Well, because when the child is in movement, the world is moving around them and it's easier to process objects that come up in front of them. The other thing that you might see with a child with CVI, which is really interesting, you may see that the child with CVI moves their head or their body back and forth. And it's very easy to, you know, to mistake this for a sensory stim, for a sensory stimulation or self-stim, you know, like rocking or even like a, you know, what we used to call like a blindism, like a behavior that is sensory seeking, right? And that would be a mistake to assume that it is just a sensory stimulation behavior. Often kids with CVI do this rocking their head back and forth, you know, swinging their head back and forth or moving their whole body back and forth, because the world is not interesting and observable if it's still, if it's stable. But when I move my head, the world appears to be moving, and now it's easier to process the things that are in front of me. So if you ever see a student doing that, what you might try to do is pick up something in front of them that you think they might be, you know, trying to get a better look at, and move the object back and forth instead. And you will see that the student will stop their movement because now they don't need to be moving. Now the object is moving. And when I first saw this, this was like a real light bulb turned on in my understanding of CVI. And I thought, wow, this is a real perfect example of how people misunderstand kids with CVI and how easy it is to label something as a behavior when in fact it's a really amazing compensatory skill or a coping skill that your student developed in order to better process the world. So further along the range, kids don't need things to be moving at near, but they need things to be moving at a distance, and it's easier to see targets further away if they're moving. So one thing I would try if you have a student who's a little further along, when you come into the room to greet them, don't greet them verbally first. Wait a second. See if you can get the student's attention by making some movement rather than verbally introducing yourself. And, you know, why not just like wave hi, do a conventional gesture to try to find the student with some movement before identifying yourself. It's not that, you know, we don't want to provide kids with auditory cues and everything, but very often we don't work on developing visual progress because we're providing kids with all of those cues that they need so that they don't have to use their vision. But kids with CVI can use their vision if we give them those supports. And that's really important for kids who are in phase 2 and phase 3. Right, so on the kind of lower side of visual functioning, phase 1, early phase 2, we're really only looking at things that have bright colors, bright reflective properties like lighting and movement. One thing I noticed, and you see on the picture on the right, is that working with infants or babies with CVI, most of the mobiles, most of like the baby mobiles that are available, you know, on the market are actually really complex. They're not visually simple. And they tend to also not use bright saturated colors. They tend to use kind of these baby pastel tones. And so it may be if you're working with younger kids that you need to make your own, because the ones that are commercially available are not really great for kids with CVI. Okay, so the next characteristic here is visual latency. And kids with CVI may tend to have a visual processing delay. It is the length of time between when something is shown to the student and when they look at or orient toward it. This is different from motor latency and cognitive latency. So it's not about the student understanding what's there. It's just about recognizing, is it there or not? And this is something that I've noted in kids. I've often been asked to sort of come into schools serving kids with autism and say, well, we're not sure if the visual behavior is an autism thing or if maybe it's a risk factor for CVI. And what I've noticed is that kids with autism, yes, they don't look at faces as often, depending on the student. They have lots of overlapping features with CVI. They may kind of have this kind of stare off into nowhere sort of thing that's typical of kids with CVI. But a child with autism will take a quick look at something if you show it to them. They may not be interested in it, but this pen in their visual field, they're going to take a quick look and then they're going to decide, no, I don't care about that, or oh, I'm interested. But a child with CVI may not notice it at all, or they may take a long time to notice that it's there. And that's very different and unique. So earlier on the range, we probably have visual latency for everything. Further along the range, visual latency decreases with warm-up time, meaning that once we've been using our vision for a little while and looking at different things, now you don't see the latency. And then even further along, you're only seeing visual latency when the child is tired, stressed, overstimulated, or post-seizure. Okay. So here's sort of a classic CVI look. You've got this student looking at the slinky in front of them, and it's like she's not looking, and then she's looking. But I like this picture on the right because it really shows a classic kind of like visual regard. Okay, it's not a fixation. It's not looking directly at something. It's sort of this, almost like side-eyed, head half-turned. It's different from eccentric viewing, right? For kids who have ocular issues, it's not like a head tilt in a unique way. It's just a little bit of like a peripheral regard. I'm not looking right at it, but I can tell that it's there. That's the type of orientation we're looking for, and it's a visual regard, different from a visual fixation. Okay. The next visual characteristic is visual field preferences, and I want to emphasize that it's not field losses. A field loss or a field cut means that there's no information in that visual field. So if a student has a field loss from an ocular visual impairment, they have no access to information in this right visual field. A student with CVI may have a strong left field preference and they prefer to see things on the left side, but it's not a loss on their right side. It's just a preference for their left side. And so it means that information's harder on the right side, but not impossible. And over time, we're going to strengthen the left side and we're going to start to see the right side emerge as well. So the typical progression for this from lower visual functioning up towards typical is first we start with one strong peripheral field, and it could be left or right. And then as the student makes progress, both left and right, and then upper, and then central when we start to see eye to object contact, right around halfway through the range. And then finally, it's that lower visual field that tends to be difficult for kids all the way through the CVI range on into phase 3. Now, obviously, that has major implications for an educational environment, because in an educational environment, we present a lot of information in the lower visual field, right, on the student's desk. So we need to make adaptations for that. And that's why one of the easiest go-to recommendations or accommodations for a child with CVI is in the school to put items on a slant board. Okay, anything that's two-dimensional, like a book that can sit up on a slant board, it's a good idea to try that. items that are three-dimensional and that are going to roll off a slant board, you might think about raising up a little bit, like on a stand or a box, getting a little bit higher up in their visual field. Some things that we really can't do that with, like, you know, in mealtime, we're not going to like put the food all the way up on a tray up here so they have to reach for it. Those are things that we're going to have to accept. The student's going to have a harder time with that, so maybe they need to be visually more adapted. A bright red bowl or something like that, so it's really easy to see in that lower visual field. And we're going to see examples of these things when we get into intervention. Right, so you got a student on the lower side of visual functioning really only seeing a bright red balloon in the right peripheral field. This was an interesting one. We'll talk about more in intervention, different ideas like this. This is a student who's starting to develop some central visual field processing. He's looking eye to object contact directly at something. And in the morning circle routine, he was looking in the mirror to identify that he came to school today. And the team did something really innovative. They took a trifold board, which, you know, usually we use to present information in front of a student. They put it behind him so that it created a black background behind him so he could have a better time looking at his own face, right? So he didn't have that busy background behind him. Like in Zoom, you know, if you're presenting in Zoom or, you know, you're working with a student, you know, remotely, you want to have a clean background. You don't want to have, you know, a busy background behind you. Same kind of principle. Okay, so I'm going to show you some videos, and I got this great little case study of this student who I think is a really excellent example of a lot of these characteristics. And you can also see kind of how subtle this is. Okay. So you're going to watch this little video, and then when you're watching this, just look out for what are the visual behaviors that you observe. And when is she looking? When is she not looking? What's going on environmentally? And also what's going on in the objects that she's being presented with, or the targets or the tasks. So let's watch it, and then we'll go back through it, and I'll talk you through what we saw. So note the environment. She is eating, she's sitting at the table, she's eating, and she's also, we can't see what she's watching, but she's watching like a cartoon or something on the iPad in front of her.
Hey, Chris, this is Peggy. I'm sorry to jump in, but does this have audio to it? We do have some folks that are visually impaired watching, so if you could maybe do a little description, that would be great.
Yeah, exactly. So so it's a 20-second video. First, I'm going to show the video, and then I'm going to talk you through exactly what we see. So I'll do an audio description the second time that we watch it. So first I'm going to give you an opportunity to do a visual observation, but then I'm going to talk you through everything that happens here. So just 20 seconds, and then I'll do it one more time.
Thank you for purchasing. Now we won't talk anymore. Well done, Peppa.
What shall I film first?
Now, please.
Okay, Peppa.
Hello, I'm Peppa Pig.
Okay, so I'm going to talk you through what we observed here. Where's the... Okay, so we're going to watch it through one more time, and I'm going to talk you through exactly what we saw. Okay, so this little girl is sitting at her at the kitchen table. I think it's her sister is to her right side, and she is eating a meal. She's also watching an iPad with some kind of cartoon or something in front of it. We can't see what's on that iPad screen. Her sister is going to introduce this little blue fidget toy, little plastic blue fidget toy in her right visual field while she's watching and eating. Okay. Now what's happening now is she's not looking, she's not looking, she's still eating, she's kind of looks like she's watching the screen in front of her. Something really interesting happens here, which is that right when her sister starts to move this toy, which is about 2 feet away from her on her right visual field, she sees it and starts to reach for it without even looking for it. Okay? She's not looking at it at this point, but she can see that it's there. Now that is a good example of identifying something in your dorsal stream, in your peripheral field. She doesn't even need to look at it with central vision to recognize that it's there. That's pretty unique to CVI. Now she looks over at it. She's looking while reaching. She's still looking right at it while reaching. She's got some nice emerging eye-to-object contact. Okay, but then as soon as she comes into tactile contact with it, she looks away. And she's kind of tapping it and feeling for it and getting it in her hand, but she's still looking away. She's still looking away, and she's not looking at it while she's holding it. Okay. A couple interesting things that happen there. Watch a second video, and same thing. This one is only 19 seconds long. In this video, she's with her mom walking down the steps, the front steps in front of her house. There's 4 steps that are stone. They don't stand out visually because they're all gray stone. There's a black rail, handrail on her right side, and her mom's going to walk alongside her on her left side. Her mom's also holding this cane, and if there's any orientation mobility instructors here, I just want to emphasize this is not an O&M lesson. This is just walking down the stairs with her mom. Okay, so we're going to watch the video, and then I'm going to talk you through exactly what we see.
You want to? Come on down. You like to walk on the grass? I like the way you're looking down. Okay, that's good, Christina.
Okay, so let's walk through it. She's at the top of the steps. She's holding onto the rail with her right hand while she's kind of looking down and taking a step down. Okay. Then something interesting, her mom's holding her hand too, holding her forearm. Something interesting happens. She lets go of the rail and she kind of looks straight ahead. She almost looks as if she is not looking at anything. She's giving this sort of, you know, what we used to call a non-purposeful gaze, just sort of staring off into the distance. Almost looks like a student who is blind because she's not using her vision at all here. It's almost like her vision's turned off as she feels for the rail tactily, right? Not looking at the rail, feeling for it as she takes a step down. Okay, she gets down to the next step, and now there's a drop off between the stone steps and the bright green patch of grass in front of the house. And as soon as she gets to this drop off, she looks down, she looks right at the grass. Now, why would she do that? As we learned about color, there's that bright saturated color in her lower visual field, and it really stands out. Okay, so she kind of squares up next to the drop off, but then again, when she takes that step down, when she's engaged in this physical activity of stepping down, she almost turns off her vision again. Right? She looks straight ahead, not really looking at anything as she takes that step down. Okay. So we're going to come back to this student in a couple of characteristics from now, and we're going to see how, you know, we might think we have some ideas about what's going on with this student. She's not really using her vision consistently that much. It's kind of on and then it's off. Sometimes she's able to look directly, but then sometimes not. We're going to see a different kind of student in a little bit. Okay, so that told us a lot about visual fields. Lower is difficult, but when things are bright and colorful in the lower field, they're easier to see. We see some interesting things about this eye-to-object contact and this kind of looking away while reaching, which we're going to get into more later. Okay, so the next characteristic is difficulty with visual complexity. And the more kids that I see with CVI, the more that I think that this is really the characteristic of CVI. This is the overarching characteristic that has an impact on everything else. There are different types of complexity. There's 4 different types of complexity, and we're going to look at each type. The first one is complexity of the visual array, and I'm showing a picture on the screen now of Where's Waldo. Everybody remember Where's Waldo was that cartoon book that was extremely complex. Hundreds of cartoon characters overlapping in these complicated scenes. and they all kind of blend together, and there's lots of color and lots of movement. There's lots happening there. And we're looking for that one little target, which is this little guy, Waldo, with the striped red shirt and the little red hat and the glasses. He's very hard to find in this extremely busy scene with other things that kind of look like him. Okay, so imagine for a child with CVI, the whole world is kind of like a Where's Waldo, where everything is very busy and complex, and we need to have some strategies and some adaptations to figure out how to find that unique target that we're looking for against this complex background. So one thing we could do, just like with the mug, just like with the example of the mug and the pens, one thing we could do is we could outline the target with a bright color. We could make the bright color what we're looking for instead of the very difficult to see target. So I put a little red circle around Waldo, who's at the top left of the screen. And now he really pops out. And we may need to do that all the time, or we may only need to do it to preview what we're looking for. So you say to the student, we're looking for Waldo. He's in this busy array. I'm going to show you where he is. We bring in that red circle around him. Now let's take that circle away because we previewed what to look for. And let's see if we can find Waldo now. Okay. We may need to just do that for a preview, or that may not be enough. For some kids, it's still too difficult to find Waldo, so we're going to take away the rest of the background. By using an occluder, we're blacking out the rest of the background, and we just have this narrow little window of space where only the visual target is present. Same thing, we may only need to do that for previewing the environment. We may be able to then go a step back and say, okay, now can you find Waldo without the occluder, without the background blacked out? So we need to find what level of complexity can your student handle? What level of complexity do we need to adapt to? We don't want to over-adapt. We don't want to paint the whole room black, right? We just want to figure out how much can your student deal with and where are they on this sequence of complexity. Can they handle only a little bit of complexity and they need a black background for things that are introduced to them? Or can they handle a little bit more of a busy background? So the first type of complexity, just like Waldo, is complexity of the array. And that can be with 2D objects or targets, like, such as in a book, like Where's Waldo? Or it can be with 3D objects, like what you see in front of you right now is a photograph with a basket of stuffed animals, little Sesame Street stuffed animals. And there's, 4 or 5 stuffed animals in this basket. They're all overlapping each other and touching each other. So it's very hard to pick out any individual item. But when we take that item out of the complex background and we put it against a simple background, now on the right side, you've got this picture of this little Bert figure with a bright yellow face, and he's taken out of that basket and put on a chair, on a dark gray chair. And so he really pops out. There's no other objects around him that are overlapping or on top of him. It's very easy to see him. Even from a further distance, it's easier to see him. So we want to think about reducing the complexity of the array. Here is a little bit of an activity that I came up with to assess complexity of the array. And you can basically get a sequence of what the complexity is that your student can handle. So, and this is also on an article on Paths to Literacy if you're looking for the full explanation. Okay, so we start with just a simple object. We've got a bright orange plastic figure of a goldfish. Okay, this is a little, just a little plastic animal toy. Bright orange, solid single color. So let's see, can your student find that bright orange target, bright orange little plastic toy, against a black background with nothing else around it? Okay, if they can do that, then can they go to the next step in the sequence? Can they find this target? And on the upper right side, you see a picture of that goldfish against a black background still, but with other little plastic animal toys around it. Now notice that none of those animal toys are touching each other. They're not overlapping. They're spaced about 1 inch apart from each other. And also none of them are a bright orange color. We've got bright green ones and a purple one and some white and gray ones and so on. And it still pops out, right? So can your student find this against a little bit more complex array, but still not too complex? So if they can find that, can they find it now in the third step in the sequence on the bottom left side of the screen against a patterned background? So we've got our little goldfish. We've also got some other stuff, some other little plastic animal toys. And now they're against a piece of fabric that is bright blue with some blue, magenta, purple, yellow, green polka dots, right? Lots of little dots. But the plastic goldfish still pops out because bright orange still pops out against a blue background. Okay, so if they can find it here, now can they find it in the fourth step in the sequence against a very complex camouflage background that has some orange patterns on it? So now on the fourth one in the bottom right side, we've still got our little plastic goldfish toy. We've still got the other animals around it. But now it's against a piece of fabric that has multiple orange, yellow, red colors on it. And it kind of blends into the background. And you might be looking at this picture and saying, well, I mean, that's hard for anyone, right? But that's only in the photograph, right? In 3D real life, when you're showing this to a student, it should still pop out because it's a 3D object, right? So a child who doesn't have CVI is going to have no problem finding that goldfish in the fourth sequence because it's a 3D object. And I've seen children with CVI sort of fall off at any point in this sequence. I've seen a student who can find it by itself, but not against a background with other animals, who can find it in the second one, but not the third one, who find it in the third one, but not the fourth one. And this is just an example. You could create your own sequence like this. You may be thinking, well, my student's not really interested in this plastic toy, so it's not going to be motivating. They're not going to do this activity. Well, find something that they are motivated by. It could be an edible goldfish. It could be some Skittles, whatever it is that's going to get the student to be actively searching against an increasingly complex background. Last thing on this type of assessment to figure out how much complexity can your student deal with is once you see that they drop off and they can't do it anymore, try shining a flashlight on the goldfish. So now we're looking, and you see on top of the image on the left, on the bottom left side, the goldfish has a flashlight shining on it. If they can't find it against a complex background, can they find it with a flashlight? Okay. And that's helpful too to understand, well, in a busy array, can they do it with an adaptation? So in the same way that we deal with complexity of the array of things, we also have various levels of complexity of targets. Individual objects have different levels of complexity. So I'm showing 4 pictures of different toys on the screen, and they all have different levels of complexity. Probably the lowest complexity is this bright yellow rubber duck. Right? It's got some orange on it, it's got those eyes, but it's still pretty simple. We're really just looking at that bright yellow color. Now imagine holding this bright yellow duck up in your right visual field, like our simulation. You're not looking directly at it. How much information do you get about it with your dorsal stream? Probably a good amount. You probably have no trouble identifying even what it is, even if you're not looking at it. From there, we may be going to this shape sorter toy, this ball, where you can put the shapes in. And it's a little more complex because it's blue and red, but it's still pretty easy to see. Then from there, it's probably on the right side, this ring stacker toy that has bright wooden rings that you stack on a little pole. That's a little more complicated because you have multiple colors kind of overlapping. And finally, on the top center is probably the most complex. It's a little wind-up toy train with a little guy in it, and it's a lot of multiple colors on top of each other. It will be very hard for a student with CVI to be able to tell what that is using their dorsal stream. and also to be able to orient it and make out its features. Find the front, find the back, find the head, find the wheels, and so on. Okay, third type of complexity is complexity of faces. Kids with CVI have difficulty looking at and making eye contact first with any faces, and then over time with unfamiliar faces. And I'm showing on the screen right now a picture with 12 different blurred faces, and they're all numbered. And they're blurred out, so they're a little hard to tell what they are. But they're images of different celebrities' faces. And you can probably tell who many of these people are. Was anybody able to identify number 6? Number 6 is a face of a person definitely with kind of dark hair, a man with dark hair, and a big, thick, black mustache. Anybody able to identify number 6?
Saddam Hussein.
Somebody says Saddam Hussein. Anybody else think something different? Usually people think it's either Saddam Hussein or Tom Selleck, right? And the reason that you might think it's one of those two people is because you're looking for an identifying feature, that big, thick, black mustache that is sort of signature of both of those people. You're correct. It's Saddam Hussein. It's not Tom Selleck. One time I showed this and someone absolutely insisted that it was Tom Selleck. The reason that you're doing that is because you're looking for defining characteristics of people. Okay? So complexity of faces, I think, overlaps with another characteristic, which is difficulty with visual novelty. It's easier for kids with CVI to see and look at things that are familiar to them. And that's because they're looking for identifying features. They're looking for something that really pops out and stands out. And kids have an easier time looking at faces that are familiar to them. They may be confused by faces that look similar or have similar features. And I saw a student with CVI who really had difficulty differentiating his mom from the speech pathologist. Why was that? Because they both wore thick black rimmed glasses and had long, thick black hair. Okay, straight, thick black hair. So there were defining features that were getting confused between mom and the speech pathologist. Okay, so that's interesting. It shows sort of what kids with CVI are looking at and looking for to try to identify what's around them. Okay, the fourth type of complexity is complexity of the sensory environment, or multisensory complexity, it's also called. And I'm showing a picture here on the left side of a little girl who is in a PT room, and the PT and I think it's the paraprofessional are helping her get onto and orient onto a bright red yoga ball that she's going to sit on. And you can see that the PT's on one side of her holding her onto her, and the para's on one side of her holding onto her, and they're kind of moving her body, manipulating her. There's a lot going on physically. There's a lot of sensory input. You can imagine there's sounds in the room, there's lots of stuff going on, and there's two people touching her and positioning her. She also has low motor tone, low muscle tone. And so she has trouble, kind of like maintaining a strong posture. So anytime there's all this extra input and we're working so hard physically, vision is going to be dramatically reduced. PT and gym are examples of activities, and even recess, if it's noisy and busy, are examples of activities where vision is going to appear to be much lower, right? Because there's so much going on and it's hard to focus on vision at the same time as focusing on these other things. We saw that in that video of the little girl walking down the stairs. When there's a lot going on, she's working hard on the physical aspect of it, or even at the table when she's focusing on the video in front of her. It's hard to use vision at the same time for multiple things. So you can sort of break down complexity of the sensory environment into external factors, like the lighting, the noise, the background information, even the temperature of the room. when it's very warm in the room, we all get a little bit drowsy, right? But for a student with CVI, when it's a little warm in the room, they may have reduced visual processing. They may have a reduced ability to focus their vision because their biophysical status is out of equilibrium. It's out of balance. So you may actually see a reduction in vision. Positioning and trunk support is huge. Kids tend to do a lot better visually when they're in stable positioning. That doesn't mean that the student always has to be in stable positioning. So in PT and gym, maybe if they're in a stander or something like that, they're not going to do as well visually, and that's totally okay. It just means don't expect as much for them visually when they're in positions that are harder for them to, focus in. They're just focusing on the physical part. There's also internal factors that we may or may not have control over. The student's tired, they're hungry, they're in pain, they're on medication, like seizure meds make them a little bit drowsy or tired or irritable. Well, that's also going to have an impact on vision. For kids who don't have CVI, it may have an impact on their attending behaviors, but not on vision. This is very unique to CVI. Even how the student's feeling emotionally may have an impact on their vision. So that's something we really need to get around understanding. One of the most common misconceptions about CVI that I hear people say all the time is that kids with CVI have variable or fluctuating vision. Oh, yesterday their vision was great. I don't know what's going on today. Why aren't they using their vision today? It must be because they're being stubborn, or it's a behavior, or this or that. It's not the child's vision that's fluctuating. It's the complexity of the environment that's fluctuating, both the internal and the external factors, some of which we have some control over, some of which we don't, and some of which we may not even know unless we get some background information from the family, like understanding child didn't get much sleep last night, so their vision is going to be compromised today. Important to know. Okay, we're going to hear now, as we get these next 5 characteristics, we're going to start to understand that these characteristics overlap constantly. We've already talked about light, right? Because it overlaps with other characteristics like movement and color and complexity. So we're probably going to breeze through these next characteristics a little bit quicker because we've already kind of discussed them. Now, we used to call this characteristic light gazing or non-purposeful gaze, but now we're calling it need for or attraction to light. So if you had a training on CVI in the past, more than 3 or 4 years ago, you probably heard this term light gazing or non-purposeful gaze. We're not calling it that anymore because light gazing and non-purposeful gaze only applies to kids who are lower on the range. It really only applies to kids in phase 1 and maybe early phase 2. But need for light and attraction to light applies to kids all the way through the range. Light gazing, which is more for kids who are lower on the range, is that just what it sounds like, staring at bright lights, ceiling lights or windows. Non-purposeful gaze is that sort of staring off into space that we saw with the student in the videos. It tends to happen when the student is overstimulated, or when they're just trying to attend auditorily or tactily. When they're trying to listen, they may look away. So don't mistake that for non-attending. It may actually be the opposite. Don't ever find yourself saying to a student with CVI, look at me or look at this. Okay? And it's okay if you've done it before. I've done it before too, but now I really catch myself when I feel like I'm about to say that. If a student is not looking, it's because something is too difficult to look at. So instead of making a verbal prompt, try making a visual prompt, like shine a light on it, or make it move a little bit, or add a bright color, or reduce the complexity. So if you think about it this way, a verbal prompt is not going to help a visual problem, right? Just saying, look at this, doesn't change the fact that it's hard to look at. So instead, anytime you feel like you want to say, look at me or look at this, try changing something. Try adding light, adding movement, adding color, or reducing the complexity, or moving it into the student's preferred visual field. We don't use that term, or I don't use that term non-purposeful gaze anymore, because non-purposeful gaze is purposeful. It serves the purpose of helping the student to attend auditorily or tactily or physically. The student needs to look away in order to focus on that thing that they're doing. So again, it's not a sign of not attending. It actually is maybe the opposite. It may be a sign that the child is attending better when they're looking away. That's okay. Light gazing, pretty easy to observe. The student's staring up at bright light. Why is she doing that? In this picture, you've got a little girl who's light gazing while someone is spoon feeding her, right? So she's trying to focus so hard on that difficult task of eating. She needs to look away while that's happening. Non-purposeful gaze. We saw it in the video, but here's a little picture. Here's a picture of a little boy who is kind of engaging in this staring off into space, kind of looking, behavior, because he's drinking through the straw, and that's a multisensory complex activity. So he needs to kind of look away while he's doing that. Consider if you have kids who are in adapted seating, like a Riften chair, consider what they're looking at all day if their heads are tilted back in order to compensate for low muscle tone in their neck, right? So their head doesn't flop down, they're at this like 60-degree angle. What are they looking at all day? Those terrible fluorescent panel lighting that we have in schools, right? I'm sure you have them over there. We definitely have them all over here. So consider, what's a student looking at all day if they're in that position? Bright lights. So no wonder they're light gazing. That's what they know how to look at. All right, so light gazing, non-purposeful gaze, like we said, really is more for kids at a lower end of visual functioning. As they make progress on into phase 2 and phase 3, they may still benefit from light to enhance their attending. So that's where we start to use light boxes and light pads and iPads for functional purposes, not just for looking at the swirly mat or, looking at a bright colored, object on the light box. That would be more phase 1 and early phase 2. But the use of the light box, the light pad, or the iPad becomes more of a functional use as we move on. And we've got a picture of a little girl who's looking at letters on the light box, and she's looking at the teacher's hand signing those letters in front of her. Also using light to illuminate an object. We got a picture on the right side of a flashlight illuminating a set of bright, shiny red beads. Okay, so just like we've talked about, if the student's not looking, try use light to enhance their attending. Okay, so remember that little girl that we watched the video of earlier? We watched 2 videos of her earlier. Now let's see another video of the exact same student. This is filmed the exact same week that those other 2 videos were filmed. So this is not a different student. This is not a different time. Now she's sitting in a little corner of the room with no complexity of the background, no distractions, nothing really else in her view, no other physical activity. She's sitting at a table that's black background. There's nothing else on the table except for her iPad on a slant board. And there's a trifold board behind it in order to block off any complexity of that background. And what you're going to see in this video, which is about 45 seconds long, we don't even need to talk through the second time, you're going to see a totally different student who is making eye-to-object contact the entire time that she's playing this game of dragging a bright colored shape into, into a hole. I think that this app is called Baby Shapes or something like that.
Small, circle, big, circle.
She's dragging the circle shapes into a little hole.
Small, circle, big, circle.
She's also chewing on a chewy tube.
Big, circle, small, circle.
Chris,
Circle.
the video is, we can hear the audio, but the video seems to have.
Oh, you
frozen.
can't see the video?
It froze for part of it. It just changed, but.
Okay. Here, let's just watch from the beginning again a little bit. We don't have to watch the whole thing, but you'll see it's constant eye to object contact. She's using her central vision and fixating the entire time and not looking away, which is almost a totally different student than the one that we saw in the first 2 videos. Let's just watch this again a little bit.
Small, circle, big, circle. Big, circle, small, circle. Pink, circle. Yellow, triangle.
Okay, so you get the idea, right? This is a student who we saw in the earlier videos, was doing a lot of looking away, had difficulty looking and reaching at the same time. Given the right adaptations, the accommodations to reduce the complexity around her, also the backlighting from the iPad, just the lit surface of the iPad helps to enhance her attending. It's also a pretty simple array. There's bright, colorful shapes. She's able to do this, and it's probably a familiar task. It looks like it is. She's able to do this task consistently, looking right at it. She's even able to touch small little buttons on the screen and navigate the iPad pretty well. It almost looks like a different student. So this really shows us the difference that accommodations, environmental and material accommodations make. It's the exact same student who has more difficulty in a noisy, complex environment where there's more physical interaction and more tasks to focus on. Okay, so we're going to come back to talking about this a little bit more when we look at the types of interventions that we might design for a student, because it's not cut and dry, right? We have to think about what adaptations does she need when we're focusing on intense visual tasks, and what adaptations does she need when we're focusing on physical tasks or on, multisensory tasks? And those two things may be a little different. Okay, the next characteristic is difficulty with distance viewing. Kids with CVI tend to have difficulty looking at things that are further away from them, or may only be able to see things further away if they're bright, moving, colorful, or, in a preferred field. So, you can kind of get the idea of where we're going with this. It's the same kinds of characteristics overlapping, same types of adaptations, just in a different context. Now, difficulty with distance is actually the exact same thing as difficulty with visual complexity. To explain myself there, we're looking at a photograph, and it's kind of blurry, but it's a bright yellow shape sorter toy with a blue lid on a shelf. If you are 2 inches away from that and your face is right up next to it, it's the only thing that you see. You're only looking at that one object because you're so close to it. But the further away you get from it, if you take 10 steps back, now we're looking at a picture with that same shape sorter toy on the bottom in the middle of the screen, but it's on a shelf with dozens of other bright, colorful, complex toys. So the further we are away from something, the more is in our array. The closer we are from something to something, the less is in our array. So distance is exactly the same thing as complexity. It's not that kids have acuity issues related to, myopia, nearsighted, or farsightedness. Okay. Now you see a picture of an empty hallway. There's a man walking about 20-30 feet away with a bright yellow jacket. Bright colors to attract a student's attention at a distance. Okay. The next characteristic is difficulty or atypical visual reflexes. There's 2 primary visual reflexes, blink reflexes, that you should have. The first one is a blink to touch on the brow in between the eyebrows above the bridge of the nose, kind of right between the eyes. That's a blink to touch reflex. Blink to touch between the eyebrows. And that is actually a prenatal reflex. That is a reflex that you should have actually before birth at about, I think it's at about, 18 weeks gestation. You should have that reflex. If you don't have that reflex at birth or, on into life, that is a very big red flag that there's a neurological visual processing issue. That blink reflex may be absent altogether. It may be latent, meaning that you touch and then maybe 2 seconds later there's a blink, or inconsistent. Sometimes there's a blink, sometimes there's not. Then there's blink to threat. When something's coming at your face, you can practice this with moving your hands slowly towards the student's face. Try it in different fields. Try it on the right side, left side, from below, from above, centrally. Not too fast because you don't want like air going towards the student's face and that's going to make them blink. Blink to threat, you do not have at birth, but you should have, by a few months after birth, I think 6 months or something. And so, again, these blinks may be absent, latent, or inconsistent. Now, this is obviously not a characteristic that we're adapting for. This is a characteristic that just helps us gauge kind of where is this student in their visual functioning. The next one is difficulty with visual novelty, and we talked about this already when we talked about faces. Kids with CVI tend to look at things that are familiar to them better than unfamiliar things. Also, familiar environments can be easier for them to navigate than unfamiliar environments. This is the opposite of typical visual processing. In typical visual processing, when we see something that's unfamiliar to us, it makes us look closer rather than make us overwhelmed and, oh, I can't look at that. In typical visual processing, it makes us want to scan and explore and figure out what is it that I'm looking at. But in CVI, it's just too much to deal with something that is new and unfamiliar. So earlier in the range, kids with CVI can't look at things that are unfamiliar at all, can only look at familiar objects, environments, or people. Further along, they can look at new things, but only if they share characteristics of familiar things, like a certain color or a certain feature. Or it may be that newer things are just difficult for kids in more complex environments, like at the grocery store is an example of a very complex environment. Here's a little internet meme that I found, which says, name one thing in this photo, and it's got a photo of a bunch of complex objects and items, and I don't even know what it is that we're looking at here. It's a lot of kind of overlapping things, and it's hard to tell what it is that's going on in this picture. Now, what you probably did, if you're looking at this photo, you probably got a little closer, right? Because it made you want to look more and try to find something. And if you're looking at this, then try to think about what are my visual behaviors when I try to look at and understand this new novel thing. Well, the first thing is you looked closer, and then you probably did some very specific visual scanning. You looked at a big object, like on the bottom right side, there's something there that's kind of this brown shape. It maybe looks like a wig, or I don't know what that is. And you maybe thought through your mind, you scanned through your brain, like what could that possibly be? And you try to compare it to other things that you've seen before, like maybe a wig or something, but maybe it doesn't quite fit. And you're like, I don't know what that is. So you skip to the next thing. And in this way, you're scanning and you're organizing and you're kind of trying to categorize in your brain, but nothing quite adds up. So you discard it and you look for the next thing. On the left side, there's this weird kind of thing that maybe looks like a jewelry rack or something like that. Again, I don't know what it is, but I'm scanning my brain and I'm comparing to other images that I have in my brain. So the brain is like a Google image search. If you ever use Google Images, you type in a term and thousands of images come up for that term. If you have typical visual processing, you have millions of images in your brain. And when you see something new, you put it in that Google image search and you look for other things and you try to see if anything is a fit. And if it's not, you discard it or you put it in a new category. Oh, that's something I haven't seen before, so like let's set that aside and put it there. Kids with CVI don't have images in their Google image search, or maybe they have one image. So when a child with CVI searches for the term dog in their brain, maybe like one image comes up, as opposed to a person with typical visual processing searches the term dog and thousands of images come up. And when you see a new dog that you've never seen before, maybe you see a new breed of dog you've never seen before, you know how to identify it because you put that image and you look close. You, oh, what is that? Looks like a dog. How do I know that? Because I input it into my Google image search, I scan around, I figure out what it matches with, and I put it there in those images. Kids with CVI have difficulty doing that. So when we come back later this afternoon and we talk about intervention, a lot of our focus when we get up towards late phase 2 and phase 3, it's about what do we need to do to fill that Google image bank. And that's a huge goal of intervention. Now, in CVI, familiarity is easier because CVI is all about exposure and learning. The child has learned to look at things that are familiar to them, things that they have had more exposure to. They've been able to put that image into that Google image bank and be able to recognize it. So we're building that image bank with 3D objects and then later on with 2D. The last characteristic, and then we're gonna take a little break in just a couple minutes, 5-7 minutes. The last characteristic, which we've also already talked about, is absence of or difficulty with visually guided reach. I'm holding up my coffee cup right now. Visually guided reach is the ability to look at, reach for, and tactily explore or interact with an object or target simultaneous to looking at it. We're looking and interacting tactily at the same time. Together, it's integrated. Kids with CVI may do a look away and reach, or like we saw in the video, we do a look, reach, and then as soon as we're touching, we look away. Or they may do, they can't see it at all. They kind of tell something's there, but I can't look at it at all, so I'm going to feel around for it. Like the little girl did with the rail when she was walking. Okay, if you have kids who have motor impairments, who cannot do visually guided reach for motoric reasons, not for visual reasons, can't do it for motoric reasons, they can't initiate a reach. You got to think outside the box with this characteristic and consider that visually guided reach is kind of the same thing as multisensory complexity. Can the student look and tactily interact at the same time? So even if the child can't physically reach, can they be in physical contact with something, with a hand under hand support, or helping them to explore something, or even having, you know, some physical contact with another person? Can they do that and use their vision at the same time? So here's a picture that's pretty classic of visually guided reach. We've got a little girl holding on to like a little manipulative toy, multicolored plastic toy with rings on it that's in front of her. She's looking away. And to the left of that toy is this bright, purple pom-pom. So it may be that if we took away that pom-pom, there's not as much complexity in front of her, and maybe she's able to look at it. Maybe that's not enough to take that away. Maybe we want to shine a flashlight on that toy to help her look at it, or we want to move it a little bit, and that's going to help her look at it. Or she may just not be able to. She may need to look away while feeling that, and that's okay too. Now, what you've been able to see so far is that the characteristics overlap, right? It's not just about color, it's about light and color. It's not just about color, it's also about color and movement. And it's not just about complexity, it's also about bright colors, saturated features, and so on. Now, on the picture on the right side, there's a bunch of multicolored bins, like on a shelf in a classroom. There's some bright green ones, there's red ones, yellow ones. Just the fact that these are bright colors doesn't change the fact that it's still a complex array, right? So just because we did a color adaptation doesn't mean that it gets rid of the fact that it's still hard for that student because it's such a complex array. Okay, so, the last thing I want to show you here is another resource that I have for you, which is an observation notes form. It's basically a list of the characteristics in one column on a page. And then on the right column, there's a space to write in your observations for each characteristic. You've probably seen something like this before, but what I added to this was underneath each characteristic, there are little notes or tips about what you might be looking for specifically in each characteristic. So it's almost like a little cheat sheet for doing an observation and figuring out, well, okay, so I want to focus on movement, need for movement. What am I looking for? I'm looking for movement at near. What are my students' behaviors at near? What are my students' behaviors with movement at a distance? And what about movements for complex or novel materials? And each characteristic has little tips for what it is that you might be looking for that characteristic. So the first thing I would say before any assessment is necessary, I would just start to fill out that based on what you've observed in the student. How many of those characteristics can you observe? Okay, so let me stop sharing. It is 10:58. Anybody have any last little questions before we wrap up this morning session and take a break? We're going to get deep into intervention in the afternoon and educational program development. Any questions?
Hi, Chris, it's Peggy. I just wanted to say thank you for the information, especially one thing that I kind of sometimes forget about is when you talked about the movement and when you see a child moving their head back and forth, how they're really trying to look and how important it is not to kind of stop the child from doing that. So I really appreciated you reiterating that.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm hoping that, and I appreciate the comments in the chat too. I'm hoping that regardless of what your experience is with CVI already, that you get like something little like that, like an aha moment, and which I always get anytime I attend a training or even get to meet a student. So you guys are back on 11:15, and I'll see you all at 1. Okay.
All right, thank you, Chris. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And thanks, Regina, there for that other aha moment. Cool. I'll see you at 1. I'll just, same link, right? Use the same link to get in?
I think there's a second link on the flyer, but if you need me to email it to you, I can.
That's okay. I do have the flyer, so I'll just, I'll find that second link. Yeah, thank you so much.
You.
See you soon.
Yeah, and it's on the GLEC website too.
Fabulous. Thank you.